Hey there, welcome to Sleepy History Secrets, the channel where history gets weird but the voice stays calm. Tonight we're exploring the entire history of the Roman Empire, that long, astonishing and occasionally ridiculous story of how a few muddy huts by a river became the most organised mess in world history. It's the story of how a city built on ambition learned to pave roads, invent law, and then slowly collapse under the weight of its own confidence. But before you settle in and get cosy, take a quiet moment to like the video or subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy falling asleep to humanity's most impressive bad decisions. And when you're ready, drop a comment telling where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's strangely comforting to know how many of us are awake at the wrong hour, each in our own little corner of history. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and let's wander gently into the birth of Rome, where legend, mud, and stubbornness began it all. If your mind drifts, that's perfectly fine. We'll still be here, quietly unfolding the story. You wake up on the banks of a slow brown river, the Tiber, long before anyone thought to name it. The air smells of wet clay and smoke, and the only sound is the steady chorus of insects rehearsing for eternity. Around you, the land is rough, the hills small but watchful. On one of them, the Palatine, a few huts cling to the slope like hopeful ideas. No marble, no mosaics, no empire. Just mud, goats, and people arguing about who owns the least useless patch of soil. And yet this is the beginning of Rome. A city that would one day call itself eternal, mostly because no one else would. The legend says it began with twins, abandoned in a basket, floating helplessly down the same river until rescued by a wolf. In most stories, this would be where tragedy ends and wisdom begins. In Rome's case, it's where the paperwork starts. The wolf, apparently a working single mother, nursed the infants until a shepherd found them. The boys grew up, fought over which hill to build on, and settled the dispute by killing one of the applicants. Thus, the first Roman real estate conflict was resolved through the innovative use of fratricide. They named the surviving twin Romulus, because it's always the survivor who writes the city charter. The story isn't meant to be believed, it's meant to be remembered. It told Romans what they wanted to think about themselves, that they were born from the wild, protected by nature and forged by necessity. They didn't descend from gods, they climbed out of the mud bit by bit. Even their origin was political, a myth not about virtue, but about victory. In that sense, the story of the wolf wasn't bedtime folklore, it was Rome's first brand campaign. Archaeologists later found traces that match parts of the myth: small round huts, post holes cut into the Palatine soil, fragments of pottery traded from Etruria. It seems early Rome really was a gathering of shepherds, traders and opportunists. There was no plan, no grand blueprint, just an instinct that being close to a river and far from famine was good enough. You can almost picture it. Smoke curling up from thatched roofs, children chasing chickens through damp courtyards, the smell of firewood and wool mingling in the air. Somewhere nearby, someone is probably arguing about whose goat stole whose turnip. History always begins with such heroic moments. But Rome's real genius wasn't its beginning. It was its confidence in the middle of nothing. From the start, they assumed destiny owed them something. No empire yet, no language of law, but already a collective certainty that they were different. Maybe it came from living beside a river that flooded without apology. It trained them to adapt, to build again and again, until the land itself surrendered. The first leaders were kings, local chiefs with more charisma than caution. They borrowed everything: gods from Greece, pottery from Etruria, and political theatre from whoever happened to be nearby. You might say Rome invented cultural plagiarism before it was a crime. Each reign added another layer of ritual. The augur with his sacred chickens, the lictor carrying the fasces, the first outlines of a senate murmuring approval. Even the sewers were sacred. The Cloaca Maxima, a massive stone drain, part engineering project, part religious offering to the gods of hygiene. Only in Rome could plumbing be a form of prayer. By the 6th century before the Common Era, the city was half Etruscan, half Roman, and entirely ambitious. The kings ruled from their high chairs, surrounded by bronze mirrors and borrowed art, until one of them, Tarquin the Proud, overdid it. He offended enough senators to become history's first case study in public relations failure. They threw him out, swore never to have a king again, and promptly created a republic that functioned exactly like a monarchy, only with more committees. It was an early lesson in Roman politics. Nothing truly ends, it just changes vocabulary. As the huts became houses and the mud turned to paving, the Tiber still rolled past, indifferent as ever. The river had seen their beginnings and would one day see their end, but for now Rome was awake, stretching its limbs, inventing its gods and its excuses. It had the energy of something that didn't yet know how to doubt itself. A people learning to measure time not by harvest or season, but by triumph. From wolf to shepherds to kings to citizens, each stage adding another mask, another myth, another rule carved into clay. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear the hum of destiny forming, the quiet determination of a city rehearsing greatness. The sound is subtle, a hammer striking wet stone, a child shouting Latin words that don't exist yet, Senator's voice echoing down an alley made of mud and imagination. It's the heartbeat of Rome before marble, before empire, the steady pulse of an idea that refused to stay small. And so, from a river's whisper and a wolf's patience, the greatest bureaucracy in history began to stir. By the time the smoke from those first huts had thinned into the sky, the people of early Rome had already learned their first survival skill, imitation. They copied everything worth copying: architecture, weapons, drainage systems, even religion. If someone nearby had a better idea, Rome quietly took it, rebranded it, and called it destiny. This wasn't theft. This was research and development with better marketing. Their closest inspiration came from the north, the Etruscans. They were older, richer, and slightly better at pretending they weren't confused by the weather. They built cities with walls, carved temples from stone, and painted their tombs with cheerful scenes of eternal parties. To the rough settlers by the Tiber, the Etruscans looked like civilization itself, and civilization to Rome was something worth looting, politely at first. The Etruscans introduced the Romans to the magic of infrastructure, though no one called it that. They brought the arch, a piece of geometry that would one day hold up aqueducts, amphitheatres, and a few million tons of imperial ego. They taught Rome how to drain marshes, how to mark sacred boundaries, and how to lay out a city like it was meant to last. Before that, Roman streets were simply suggestions. Afterward, they had form, direction, and most importantly, places to collect taxes. The Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain, was part of this era, an enormous underground river of engineering and ambition. It kept the early Forum dry and probably half the city's smell underground. It was the first time Rome tamed nature by organising it, rather than begging it for mercy. Even the gods, the Etruscans taught, like things arranged properly. Religion, too, got an upgrade. Etruscan priests brought the art of augury, reading the future from bird flight, lightning, and the occasional chicken. Romans loved it. It was both mysterious and administrative. You could record omens in triplicate and blame the outcome on divine scheduling errors. The gods became civil servants, consulted before every major decision. Want to start a war? Check the sky. Building a temple? Consult the liver of a goat. If you're wondering whether this slowed anything down, no. Rome would go on to win wars, build roads, and conquer half the known world, all while checking bird patterns first. It was faith with a filing system. The Etruscans also shaped how Rome looked at power. Their kings ruled with symbols: the golden chair, the purple robe, the fasces, a bundle of rods tied around an axe, meant to show unity through discipline. Later, the Republic would keep that symbol and quietly drop the king. It was Rome's way of saying, we like the power, just not the person holding it. It's a lesson that empires everywhere have been relearning ever since. As the 6th century before the Common Era rolled on, Rome began to feel less like a cluster of huts and more like an experiment in momentum. Etruscan artisans filled its temples, merchants filled its markets. There were bronze mirrors, ivory combs, imported wine, all the essentials for a society on the rise. You can imagine the noise, hammers striking metal, vendors shouting in 2 languages, donkeys protesting taxes in 3. The city had become alive. Not grand yet, but restless. It had rhythm, smoke, and a growing sense that the future belonged to people who didn't ask permission. And then came the last of the kings, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. He ruled like a man auditioning for villainy. He taxed heavily, silenced the Senate, and built massive temples to remind everyone who was in charge. Rome tolerated arrogance, but not inefficiency. When Tarquin's son assaulted a noblewoman, Lucretia, and she took her own life, the outrage spread faster than a plague. The nobles united, the people followed, and the king found himself exiled by popular demand. It was less a revolution than a public sigh of relief. The monarchy was over, or at least that's what the paperwork said. In place of one man, they invented many, 2 consuls elected yearly, because the only thing Romans feared more than a tyrant was a long-term contract. They created the Senate, a council of elders who were neither particularly wise nor especially young. They built a system of checks and balances that looked perfect on parchment and chaotic in practice. It was government by argument, democracy in its teenage years. And yet, for all its flaws, it worked. The Republic turned competition into fuel, ambition into a public service, and corruption into a respected career path. Through this transformation, the ghosts of the Etruscans lingered everywhere. Their art, their symbols, their taste for ceremony, all woven into Rome's DNA. Even the word Rome might have Etruscan roots. They were the older sibling that Rome outgrew but never forgot. Every arch, every forum, every pompous parade carried a whisper of Etruria, dressed now in Latin and pride. Rome had learned its greatest lesson. You don't have to invent greatness, just organise it better than anyone else. Standing in the Forum, around the year 500 before the Common Era, you might not have known what was coming. The streets were still rough, the temples small, the Republic barely more than an experiment in self-control, but the tone was already set. Discipline, ambition, and the steady rhythm of men counting votes and debts with the same intensity. The kings were gone, but hierarchy remained, repainted as duty. Rome would spend the next 5 centuries perfecting this contradiction. Freedom built on obedience, equality maintained through conquest. A system so balanced it could only survive by constantly expanding. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the hum of transition. Bronze bells clanging from the temples, a child shouting in the market, a senator whispering about laws no one understands yet. The smell of olive oil mixes with the dust of new stones, and somewhere underfoot, the Cloaca Maxima still murmurs, that steady subterranean reminder that Rome's genius lay not in miracles but in maintenance. If the early kings had ruled by instinct and accident, the new republic decided to rule by paranoia and paperwork. After all, when you overthrow a tyrant, the last thing you want is another one, unless he happens to be you. So, Rome built a government where no single person could ruin everything. Instead, several people could ruin it together, slowly through meetings. The Republic began in the year 509 before the Common Era, a number historians like because it sounds official. For the people living it, it was just another Tuesday, except now they had to vote. 2 consuls replaced 1 king, each held equal power, at least in theory, and both could veto the other. In modern language, this was called checks and balances. In ancient language, it was called mutual irritation. Every decision took twice as long, but that was the point. If government moved slowly, no one could sprint toward dictatorship. The Senate, a collection of the wealthiest men who thought highly of themselves, became the real engine. It didn't legislate as much as it advised, loudly, constantly, and often in Latin so complicated that even Cicero would later complain about it. Still, it worked. Debate became a civic virtue, corruption a career ladder, and self-restraint a public performance. The Romans learned to trust the process more than the people running it. It was a strange kind of faith, but it built an empire. The Republic was designed around fear of absolute power, which is another way of saying fear of competence. Every office had limits. 1-year terms, rotation, shared responsibility. If you did too well, you were forced to retire before you got ideas. There was a dictator position, yes, but it was temporary. 6 months only for emergencies like invasions or paperwork backlogs. The first famous one, Cincinnatus, accepted power, fixed the crisis, and went back to farming. He became a hero precisely because he didn't enjoy the job. Later generations would treat this as proof that the system worked. Modern politicians might call it the good old days. Of course, not everyone in Rome shared in the civic harmony. The early republic was a government built for patricians, the noble families with enough money to own armour, horses and opinions. The rest of the population, the plebeians, mostly worked, paid taxes and complained. Over time, those complaints turned into protests, then negotiations and finally representation. The plebeians demanded their own officials, the tribunes, who could protect them by shouting veto loudly enough to stop legislation. The word means I forbid, though it really meant not until you talk to us first. It was a clever move, Rome's first example of political leverage disguised as virtue. Then came the 12 Tables, the Republic's first written laws. They were carved onto bronze tablets and displayed in the forum for everyone to see, which was noble in theory. In practice, only a fraction of citizens could read them, and even fewer could afford to hire someone to explain them. Still, the symbolism mattered. Rome had learned the power of written law. Once you carve a rule in bronze, it feels permanent, even if no one follows it. It was a small step toward equality, and a giant leap for legal drama. This structure, consuls, senate, tribunes, and law, created a fragile but functional order. To hold together a city that was constantly expanding, Rome needed cooperation backed by competition. They managed this balancing act with the grace of a man juggling torches on a windy day. Somehow, it worked. Rome fought off neighbouring tribes, consolidated its alliances, and built the kind of reputation that makes people nervous even centuries later. Their soldiers fought as citizens, their citizens voted as soldiers, and their politicians pretended this was sustainable. Underneath the structure, though, tension simmered. Patricians still controlled most wealth, land, and sacred offices. The plebeians had voice, but not volume. And the Senate, that noble body of public servants, began developing symptoms of chronic ambition. In Rome, public service quickly became code for personal empire building. The Republic had found its rhythm, efficient, proud, slightly corrupt, and very loud. It would stay that way for almost 500 years, which in political time is eternity. The genius of Rome's Republic wasn't just its institutions, but the habits it created. Every citizen was expected to serve, whether by fighting, farming, or filing. There was honour in participation, even if you disagreed. They called it virtues, a kind of moral toughness that combined bravery, discipline, and an ability to give long speeches without blinking. It made Romans believe that duty was more important than comfort. It also made them exhausting dinner guests. You can imagine the forum in those early centuries, open-air debates echoing off stone walls, merchants shouting prices, the smell of olives, bread, and heated argument drifting together. A senator gestures dramatically with one hand, a farmer argues back, a stray dog barks like it's making a point. Somewhere nearby, a young scribe takes notes, trying to keep up with history as it happens. It's chaotic but alive. Democracy before microphones, compromise before coffee. Despite all its flaws, the Republic produced something extraordinary, a culture that believed disagreement was proof of freedom. They turned political anxiety into an art form. Where other nations feared division, Rome institutionalized it. 2 consuls to avoid 1 king, multiple assemblies to prevent unity, layers of bureaucracy to ensure nobody could act quickly, and yet it built stability. It's the kind of paradox that keeps historians awake and everyone else peacefully asleep. By the 4th century before the Common Era, Rome had mastered the art of managing itself and began managing everyone else. Alliances became obligations, neighbours became provinces, and the idea of citizenship started spreading beyond the city walls. The Republic was slowly turning outward. For every hill it conquered, it added another law, another contract, another marble inscription celebrating moderation. Its greatest strength, organised ambition, was also its slow undoing. Because when your political system depends on balance, the last thing you want is success. Success tilts everything. Still, in this moment, the Republic was proud, solid, and self-confident. It believed in its own endurance. The Senate met daily, the markets thrived, and soldiers marched home through triumphal arches that hadn't even been built yet. A city born from mud and myth had reinvented itself as a machine for order. It was government by habit, law, and collective anxiety. And somehow it worked. If you walk through the Forum at dusk, past the flickering torches and fading arguments, you might even believe it would last forever. Rome certainly did. You can almost feel the Republic getting restless. It had survived kings, invented law, and turned public arguing into a national sport. For a while, that was enough. But stability, for Rome, always felt like standing still, and standing still made them nervous. They needed a purpose, something to conquer, debate about, and later regret in marble. So naturally they looked across the sea and saw Carthage. Carthage was everything Rome was not: older, richer, and slightly better at minding its own business. A Phoenician colony on the North African coast, it had grown into a glittering city of traders and sailors. They built ships faster than Rome could name them, and had a knack for profit that the Senate secretly admired and publicly condemned. The 2 powers were like rival neighbours, one practical, one glamorous, destined to hate each other on principle. Eventually trade disputes turned into naval skirmishes, and skirmishes turned into war. Rome, having mastered land battles, decided to learn the sea the way it learned everything else, through overconfidence and imitation. The First Punic War, beginning in the year 264 before the Common Era, was essentially Rome's swimming lesson. They copied a captured Carthaginian ship, built an entire fleet, and promptly lost most of it to storms. Undeterred, they built another fleet, added a boarding ramp called the Corvus, and discovered that if you turn sea battles into land battles, Romans win. It was brilliant in a slightly tragic way. After 23 exhausting years, Carthage surrendered. Rome took Sicily, some indemnities, and a brand new addiction to expansion. Peace lasted about as long as a Senate recess. The Second Punic War began because Carthage, understandably bitter, decided to rebuild in Spain. Enter Hannibal, Carthaginian general, military genius, and man apparently allergic to giving up. He crossed the Alps with elephants, which even by ancient standards was considered dramatic. Snow, hunger, and ambushes killed most of his army. But he still arrived in Italy ready to humiliate Rome, and he did. At Trebia, Trasimene, and most famously at Cannae, he annihilated Roman legions with strategies still studied in military academies today. If Rome had been any other city, that would have been the end. But Rome wasn't built for surrender. It was built for endurance and paperwork. The Senate raised new armies, refused peace, and replaced generals faster than Carthage could celebrate. While Hannibal marched through Italy waiting for allies who never came, Rome quietly struck back in Spain and North Africa. Finally, Scipio Africanus invaded Carthage's homeland, forcing Hannibal to return. At the Battle of Zama, in 202 before the Common Era, Rome won decisively. Carthage was defeated, Hannibal exiled, and the Republic learned a dangerous lesson. Persistence works, even when intelligence doesn't. After 2 Punic Wars, Rome had control of the Western Mediterranean. But obsession is hard to turn off. Even in victory, senators muttered about Carthage. They feared it might rise again, rebuild its navy, or worse, compete in trade. One statesman, Cato the Elder, ended every speech with the same line, no matter the topic. Carthage must be destroyed. It was less policy and more ritual, like knocking on wood, except louder. Eventually the Republic obliged him. The Third Punic War was not really a war. It was a siege, slow and merciless. By 146 before the Common Era, Roman legions surrounded Carthage, burned it to the ground, and, according to legend, ploughed salt into the soil so nothing would grow. The story about salt is probably untrue, but it feels true, and that's what mattered to Romans. They wanted to erase not just a rival, but the idea of rivalry itself. Carthage became a cautionary tale. Resist Rome, and you will become dust. With Carthage gone, Rome stood alone in the Western world. The Senate celebrated, triumphs were paraded, and everyone agreed that the Republic had reached its peak. But success brings strange problems. Conquest had filled Rome with wealth, gold, slaves, and endless grain shipments from Africa, yet none of it distributed evenly. The gap between patrician and plebeian widened until even the gods must have noticed. Noble, families bought vast estates, worked by enslaved labourers, while small farmers, the backbone of the legions, were forced into debt and exile. The republic that had been built on citizen soldiers now relied on professional armies loyal to whoever paid them. Rome was still winning wars, but losing its balance. The Senate, of course, debated reforms and did nothing. Meanwhile, charismatic generals began realizing they could offer what the Senate wouldn't: land, stability, and occasionally better pay. It was the beginning of a new kind of politics, one that would eventually replace the Republic entirely. But in this century, Rome still believed in its old virtues: duty, order, expansion. If you walked through the city, you'd see marble temples rising, markets overflowing, and citizens whispering about the next campaign. Victory had become habit. The Republic could no longer imagine life without conquest. Even peace felt like waiting between wars. The legacy of the Punic Wars went beyond territory. They transformed Rome's psychology. It was no longer a city defending itself. It was an empire pretending to be modest. The Senate called its conquests protections and its wars liberations. Diplomacy became a polite way to demand surrender, and each new province, Spain, Macedonia, Asia Minor, added both wealth and tension. Rome had built the largest system the ancient world had ever seen, but it had no idea how to manage it. Its citizens thought in terms of duty, its senators thought in terms of profit. And somewhere in the middle, the idea of the Republic began to stretch. You can almost hear it. The quiet creak of an institution under too much weight. The voices in the forum grow louder, the speeches longer, the promises more desperate. Statues of victory gleam in the sun while farmers return from war to find their land sold to the powerful. In the distance, the Mediterranean shimmers like a mirror, reflecting a city that has conquered everything except its own appetite. The Republic had proven that it could destroy any enemy. Now it would discover that no enemy is harder to defeat than success itself. By the 1st century before the Common Era, the Roman Republic had everything: territory, wealth, and enough political tension to power a small volcano. The Senate was still meeting, still debating, still convinced that it was in control. But beneath all the marble and manners, the system was cracking. Power was drifting from the old families to ambitious generals who commanded armies more loyal than the state. The Republic had become a stage, and everyone wanted the lead role. Enter Julius Caesar, politician, soldier, and part-time walking contradiction. He was born into a patrician family with just enough prestige to be inconvenient. The Caesars had a noble blood, but not enough money to keep it looking noble. Young Julius began his career the Roman way, by pretending to be humble while making sure everyone noticed. He studied rhetoric, bribed voters, and delivered speeches so polished they could be used as mirrors. When his opponents accused him of ambition, he smiled, which was Roman for yes and thank you for noticing. Caesar rose fast. He won offices, commanded armies, and cultivated charm like a weapon. When ordinary people heard him speak, they saw a saviour. When senators heard him, they saw a problem. He knew how to flatter, to joke, to appear approachable, all while calculating 10 moves ahead. Even his baldness, which he tried to hide with an artful comb-over and a laurel wreath, became part of his legend. Vanity, after all, was more forgivable when wrapped in genius. Then came his masterpiece, the conquest of Gaul. For 8 years he marched through forests, rivers, and rebellion, turning military reports into propaganda masterpieces. Each dispatch to Rome read like an adventure novel, written by its own hero. His soldiers adored him. He shared their hardships, their wine, and occasionally their spoils. They called him imperator, commander, long before the word meant emperor. By the time he returned to Italy, he was the most famous man in the Republic. Fame, however, is just popularity with better enemies. The Senate, now dominated by his rival Pompey, ordered him to disband his army and return quietly. Caesar had another idea. Standing on the banks of a shallow river called the Rubicon, he faced the ultimate career choice: obey or seize power. He chose both. He crossed the river with his legion, a symbolic act of no return. Let the dice be cast, he said, though historians debate whether he really said it, or if someone added that later for dramatic flair. Either way, it worked. The phrase has outlived every senator involved. Crossing the Rubicon was less about geography and more about psychology. It meant the Republic's invisible boundary between authority and ambition had finally dissolved. Caesar marched toward Rome. Pompey fled to Greece. Civil war followed. It was swift, brutal, and strangely efficient, like everything Caesar touched. He defeated Pompey's forces at Pharsalus, pursued him to Egypt, and arrived just in time to witness another historical subplot: Cleopatra. Egypt was supposed to be a diplomatic mission. Instead, it became an episode of international scandal. Cleopatra, young, intelligent, and fluent in politics, met Caesar wrapped, so rumour claimed, in a carpet. They became allies, lovers, and public relations legends. He helped her secure the throne. She helped him secure headlines. For a man who had already conquered Gaul, it was a logical next step: conquering gossip. When Caesar returned to Rome, he came not as a politician, but as a phenomenon. He was declared dictator, not for 6 months as tradition allowed, but indefinitely. The Senate, too tired or too afraid to resist, showered him with honours. Temples were dedicated, statues raised, months renamed. He wore purple robes, minted coins with his face, and restructured the calendar, the one you still use today. That's right. Your leap years are a souvenir from Caesar's schedule. It's proof that even after 2,000 years, bureaucracy remains immortal. Yet for all his reforms, debt relief, public works, expansion of citizenship, his power felt wrong to traditionalists. The Republic had been designed to prevent kings, and Caesar was starting to look suspiciously like one. During a festival, Mark Antony famously offered him a crown. Caesar refused 3 times publicly to show humility. The crowd cheered. The Senate sighed in relief, and Caesar's crown refusal became the ancient equivalent of a social media stunt. Everyone knew what it meant. He didn't need a crown because he already had the throne. Opposition grew quietly, then loudly. A group of senators convinced they were saving the Republic plotted his assassination. Their leader, Brutus, was not only a friend but also rumoured to be Caesar's illegitimate son, though history as usual is vague on details and generous with irony. On the 15th of March, 44 before the Common Era, the Ides of March, Caesar entered the Senate. As he took his seat, the conspirators surrounded him. Knives flashed, confusion erupted, and the most powerful man in the world fell under the weight of his own ambition and other people's ideals. He was stabbed 23 times, a number often quoted as if accuracy could make it less tragic. Legend says he looked at Brutus and whispered, "You too, my child?" More likely, he just sighed. He'd seen this coming. He'd simply hoped to schedule it later. When the news spread, Rome didn't rejoice. It panicked. The senators expected applause. They got chaos. The people mourned the man who'd given them spectacle and security. The Republic found itself leaderless again, trapped between tyranny and anarchy, with no one left to blame but itself. Caesar had built an empire of loyalty, and even in death, it didn't vanish. Mark Antony, Octavian, and others would soon claim his legacy. The Republic was dead. It just didn't know it yet. If you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of the Senate chamber that morning. The shuffle of sandals, the murmur of disbelief, the sound of history changing direction. It's not the sound of a city falling apart, but of one shedding its skin. Rome wasn't ending. It was evolving. A new world was forming, one that would trade debate for decree, law for legend, and freedom for the comfort of one man's order. Rome was quiet after Caesar's death. Not peaceful, just stunned. The senators who had plunged their knives in him expected applause. Instead, they got silence, followed by the sound of an angry crowd sharpening its opinion. They had killed a dictator to save the Republic, but the Republic was already a ghost. No one wanted to go back to endless debates and failing harvests. People wanted stability, grain, and perhaps fewer stabbings in public buildings. The idea of shared power suddenly seemed exhausting. Into that silence stepped a boy, slight, careful, unassuming. His name was Gaius Octavius, Caesar's adopted son and heir. He was only 19, polite to a fault, and armed with the kind of patience that makes other men nervous. Where Caesar had been all charisma and thunder, Octavian was calculation in human form. He smiled rarely, spoke softly, and never forgot a slight. Rome mistook his quietness for safety, which historically is a rookie mistake. He began by playing everyone against everyone. First, he allied with Caesar's old friend Mark Antony, and with the wealthy Lepidus, forming a power trio politely called the Second Triumvirate. In modern terms, it was a political startup with too many CEOs. They divided the empire like a pie chart drawn in blood. Antony took the east, Octavian the west, Lepidus the leftovers. Together they avenged Caesar, hunted down his killers, and filled the Republic with the hum of efficient terror. Prescription lists, names of enemies to be executed, appeared on walls. Loyalty became currency. Suspicion became survival. Rome was learning that every reform comes with a receipt. Once the enemies were gone, the allies turned on each other. Lepidus was quietly pushed into retirement, the ancient world's version of being transferred to another department. Antony, meanwhile, found both love and distraction in Egypt, beside Cleopatra, the same queen who had once enchanted Caesar. Their partnership looked like romance, but smelled like strategy. Rome saw it as betrayal, an Eastern queen charming yet another Roman general. When Antony began dressing like a pharaoh and sending diplomatic letters scented with perfume, Octavian didn't have to invent propaganda, he simply printed it. The final confrontation came at Actium, a naval battle in the year 31 before the Common Era. Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, cornered Antony and Cleopatra's fleet off the coast of Greece. The sea burned, ships splintered, and the couple fled back to Egypt. When the smoke cleared, Rome had only one master. Antony and Cleopatra ended their story the old-fashioned way, with poison and poetry. Octavian ended his with a title. He called himself Augustus, meaning the revered one. It was less dramatic but far more sustainable. With that name, the Republic quietly died and the Empire was born, though no one dared say so aloud. Augustus was too clever for crowns. He kept the Senate, the consuls, and the illusion of choice. He called himself Princeps, the first citizen, as if he merely happened to be in charge of everything by coincidence. The senators cheered, the people celebrated, and somewhere in the back of the forum, democracy quietly packed its bags and slipped out the side door. Augustus rebuilt Rome's image one marble block at a time. He repaired temples, restored order, and reorganized nearly every system from taxes to traffic. He reformed the army, making it permanent, professional, and personally loyal to him. He established a postal service, census, fire brigades, and building codes. All the invisible things that make civilization appear eternal. Rome went from a sprawling republic of chaos to a clean, regulated empire where everything had a number and a file. Even the gods seemed impressed. Publicly, he promoted morality, family values, and self-restraint. Privately, his own family resembled a tragic play. His daughter Julia became notorious for her love affairs, which might have been more amusing if Augustus hadn't been the author of strict adultery laws. It was the kind of irony that makes historians smile and emperors sigh. Still, his reforms worked. For the first time in generations, Rome had peace, or at least something that sounded like it. They called it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a phrase that mostly meant no one else is allowed to start wars but us. Augustus understood that power needed symbols. He filled the city with monuments, temples to Mars, to Jupiter, and to himself, discreetly disguised as public gratitude. He commissioned poets like Virgil to write epics about Rome's destiny, and they did beautifully. In the Aeneid, the Trojan hero Aeneas wanders, suffers, and eventually founds the seed of Rome. It was mythology repurposed as national therapy. Every Roman could now believe that empire was not ambition, but duty. Even poets became civil servants. Economically, the empire flourished. Trade routes stretched from Britain to India. Ships carried wine, olive oil, and gossip across the seas. Cities grew, roads multiplied, and the forum buzzed with merchants instead of arguments. The Senate still met, of course, mostly to applaud. If Augustus sneezed, someone proposed a festival. It was efficient, predictable, and slightly eerie. Rome had traded its rough energy for administrative calm. In that calm, art thrived, law solidified, and citizens slept easier, unaware that stability, like everything Roman, came with an expiration date. Augustus ruled for 40 years. He died peacefully, a rare privilege for anyone with emperor in their resume. His final words, according to legend, were theatrical and self-aware. "Have I played my part well in this great comedy of life? Then applaud as I exit." The applause, of course, was mandatory. After him, the empire would pass to Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, men who would test every structural beam Augustus had built. Some would strengthen it, most would light it on fire. But in this moment, under the marble light of Augustus's Rome, the empire felt eternal. Citizens walked beneath triumphal arches, children memorized patriotic poems, and the streets glowed with oil lamps reflecting on clean stone. No one could imagine it ending, and that's usually how endings begin. Because once you start believing in your own permanence, The cracks have already started forming quietly beneath your feet. By the time Augustus's statues had gathered their first layer of pigeon dust, Rome had perfected the art of control. Its soldiers guarded borders, its governors sent reports, and its engineers quietly reshaped the planet. To be Roman no longer meant being from Rome, it meant living in a world where every road led to the same kind of order, paved, scheduled, and signed in triplicate. The empire was now a body, and its infrastructure the bloodstream. Stone highways stretched outward from the capital like veins from a marble heart. You could travel from Spain to Syria and never lose the sound of iron on stone. Each milestone marked progress, each bridge a signature. Legions built as they marched, leaving behind ribbons of precision that still cut through modern hills. Even the dust seemed organised. The Romans said their roads were eternal, and they were nearly right. 2,000 years later, people still use them to drive to supermarkets. Then there was water, Rome's quiet obsession. If roads were veins, aqueducts were arteries, carrying cool streams from mountains to cities too large for wells. They were miracles in stone, arches upon arches, perfectly angled to let water glide gently downhill. No pumps, no magic, just mathematics, gravity, and arrogance. Frontinus, the official water commissioner in the 1st century, wrote proudly about them. He inspected leaks, calculated flow, and complained about people stealing water through illegal pipes. Yes, water theft was a serious crime. Proof that even in paradise, plumbing could ruin everything. Walk through the capital and you'd hear it everywhere. The splash of fountains, the echo of baths, the soft murmur of clean water doing its civic duty. Rome had turned sanitation into spectacle. The baths of Caracalla, built later, could fit thousands of citizens at once, part spa, part social network. They bathed, debated, and occasionally schemed while surrounded by marble, mosaics, and steam. In a sense, the empire didn't just bring civilization, it installed it. To keep track of all this, Rome created a new class of citizen, the bureaucrat. They were the invisible machinery behind the glory. Men with wax tablets, scrolls, and enough regulations to drown a centurion. They measured grain shipments, counted taxes, and filed copies of letters to people who probably didn't read them. The empire had learned that conquest was easy. Administration was eternal. If you listen closely, you can still imagine them in dusty offices from Gaul to Judea, bent over parchment under a flickering lamp, inventing the world's first backlog. One of the most fascinating relics of that system is a map, the Tabula Peutingeriana. It shows the entire empire as a long, stretched-out ribbon of routes and stations, like a modern subway map for the ancient world. Cities appear as dots, rivers as thin threads, and distances neatly measured. It's less geography and more psychology. Proof that Romans didn't see land, they saw logistics. They thought of the world as something to be connected, standardized, and stamped with Latin names until it behaved. Citizenship itself became another kind of road, a path to belonging that stretched far beyond the city walls. By the 2nd century, half the empire's population had become Roman on paper. Merchants in Gaul, farmers in Spain, scholars in Syria, all carried the same identity. Being Roman became less about birthplace and more about paperwork. It was the world's first franchise, complete with legal rights and occasional riots. The empire discovered that unity was easier to maintain when everyone had a form to fill. Everywhere you looked, Rome organised what others ignored. Grain from Egypt fed the capital, gold from Spain filled the treasury, and olive oil from Africa kept both lamps and egos shining. The Mediterranean became a Roman lake, patrolled by ships as punctual as calendars. Messages could travel from London to Alexandria in weeks. For comparison, it sometimes takes longer today to get a package delivered across town. Rome didn't just conquer distance, it scheduled it. All this order gave the illusion of perfection, marble gleaming, fountains singing, the empire humming with purpose. But under that rhythm, something subtle changed. Control had become a religion. The Senate worshipped statistics, governors prayed to reports, and generals feared delays more than defeat. A road wasn't just a convenience, it was a statement. The empire is here, and it will remain. Each milestone whispered confidence, each aqueduct hummed inevitability. Rome had built not just a civilization, but a personality, tidy, relentless, and slightly self-satisfied. Yet there was beauty in it. Imagine standing on a hill near a Roman road at dawn. The air smells of dust and olive trees. Far off, a column of soldiers moves like a single shadow across the horizon. Behind them, the sun catches the silver of helmets, the red of standards, the gleam of order itself. Somewhere nearby, water trickles through a stone channel built centuries before you were born and destined to outlast you. It's quiet, efficient, and a little eerie. The sound of humans convincing nature to march in formation. This obsession with structure had one more effect. It standardized boredom. Every town began to look vaguely Roman. Forum, baths, theatre, temples. Local gods received Latin names. Local customs got updated with new paperwork. The empire's genius was its ability to make everything feel familiar. You could travel from one end of it to the other and still find the same menu: bread, olive oil, and gossip about taxes. It was comfort through uniformity, civilization by copy and paste. Still, the system worked. Too well, perhaps. Because when everything functions perfectly, the people running it begin to mistake maintenance for glory. The engineers who once designed aqueducts now built fountains shaped like gods. The governors who once managed famine relief now competed for statues. And the emperors, well, they discovered that control looked a lot like creation. If you can manage the world, why not improve it? Why not shape its art, its religion, its imagination? The line between governance and self-worship blurred, polished, and vanished beneath the reflection of marble. Rome had reached a strange kind of perfection, one that left it with nothing else to prove. The road still led outward, but the purpose had turned inward. It was no longer expanding, it was admiring itself. And while the water still flowed and the carts still clattered, you could feel the pulse of the empire slowing, because after perfection comes performance, and after performance, exhaustion. The empire was about to discover that no system, however flawless, can survive too much pride in its own plumbing. By the middle of the 1st century after the Common Era, Rome had reached the part of every great story where success becomes a little embarrassing. The empire stretched from the deserts of Arabia to the mist of Britain, and yet, inside the capital, people were growing restless. The streets glittered, the fountains sang, and the senators gave speeches to prove they were still relevant. But order, left unchecked, turns theatrical, and Rome was about to meet its most dramatic emperor, Nero. Nero was everything Augustus wasn't. Where Augustus whispered, Nero shouted. Where Augustus built carefully, Nero performed. He ascended the throne as a teenager, groomed by philosophers who imagined he might become a philosopher king. Instead, he became an artist emperor, a man convinced the gods had given him a voice too beautiful for government. He wrote poetry, sang on stage, and forced the Senate to attend his performances. One senator reportedly said that listening to Nero was like hearing history die in tune. For a while, Rome tolerated the spectacle. After all, it was still running smoothly. Taxes collected, water flowing, armies obedient. But in 64, after the Common Era, a fire broke out in the city. It burned for 6 days, consuming temples, homes, and whole neighborhoods. Flames devoured the skyline. Smoke blackened the Tiber. People ran through the streets shouting that the world was ending. Some said Nero watched from a tower and played music as the city burned. Historians now agree the instrument he supposedly used, the fiddle, hadn't even been invented yet. But the rumour, like most good stories, refused to die. Nero blamed the disaster on the Christians. a small, stubborn sect that worshipped one god and refused to acknowledge Rome's many. Persecution followed. It was brutal and, from a political standpoint, efficient. Nothing unites a frightened population like a convenient minority. Yet even as Nero rebuilt the city with wider streets and grander architecture, his reputation never recovered. The people whispered, the Senate plotted. And eventually the emperor who had once performed for crowds ended his life alone, muttering, "What an artist dies in me." It was admittedly a poetic exit. Rome, meanwhile, kept moving, not in spirit, but in habit. Emperors came and went, some capable, some catastrophic, all recorded by historians who wrote as if each ruler was a personal disappointment. Domitian strengthened the borders but taxed conversation. Trajan conquered Dacia, Armenia and Mesopotamia, the empire's high water mark, only to realise the sea of conquest had no shore. The legions, glorious on maps, were exhausted in reality. Marching through deserts and mountains for emperors they'd never meet, they began to suspect the empire had lost track of why it existed. At its peak under Trajan, Rome reached the Persian Gulf. Merchants cheered, generals toasted, and scribes began updating the maps again. But holding it all together proved harder than taking it. Revolts flared in Judea and Britain. Trade routes stretched too thin, and even the gods seemed tired of expansion. Trajan died on campaign, still dreaming of victory. His successor, Hadrian, inherited not a triumph, but an overextended experiment. Hadrian was many things: soldier, scholar, builder, and a man sensible enough to recognise limits. He looked at the endless frontiers and thought, perhaps for the first time in Roman history, that enough might finally be enough. He withdrew from Mesopotamia, fortified borders, and travelled endlessly to inspect them. In Britain, he ordered the construction of a massive wall, 80 miles of stone running from sea to sea, marking the empire's northern edge. It wasn't just defence, it was a statement, a line between order and everything else, between civilization and wind. Hadrian's wall still stands, patient and grey, winding over hills where sheep now graze. If you walk beside it, you can imagine the soldiers stationed there, cold, damp, watching fog drift across moors that felt like the end of the earth. For them, Rome wasn't marble or politics. It was duty, measured in patrols, rations, and the distant echo of orders from a capital they might never see. Their empire was the horizon, and beyond it the mystery of people who refused to be organised. Hadrian also left his mark in art and architecture. He rebuilt the Pantheon with its great open dome, a circle of light that still floats above the city like a promise. He commissioned villas, libraries, and memorials. He turned stability into sculpture. Under him, Rome's greatness became aesthetic rather than territorial. The empire had stopped expanding outward. It was now expanding inward, decorating itself. And in the silence between victories, it began to dream of itself more than its future. Yet, beneath the beauty, the old cracks remained. Emperors still rose through assassination, provinces still rebelled, and the Senate still applauded from habit. The machinery of empire kept running because no one dared turn it off. From the provinces, reports continued to arrive. Trade figures, census totals, letters about taxes, all neatly copied, all slightly meaningless. Rome's genius for organisation had become self-sustaining. Even without direction, it kept marching forward. You can almost hear the rhythm of the age, the clatter of carts on paved streets, the soft splash of fountains rebuilt after Nero's fire, the tapping of chisels in distant quarries. A world humming with confidence, unaware that every empire sounds strongest just before the silence. Marble shines brightest at sunset. Hadrian's wall was Rome's last great sigh, a gesture of control against the endlessness of the world. It marked where ambition paused, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. And as the wind moved over those stones, carrying the smell of rain and the cry of distant birds, the empire seemed, for a brief moment, content. It had turned conquest into geography, geography into art, and art into memory. But memory is heavy, and the empire was beginning to tire under its own perfection. By the time Hadrian's Wall began gathering moss, Rome had reached its golden Middle Age, comfortable, impressive, and quietly uneasy. The empire was vast, the cities were polished, and the aqueduct still sang with water. Everything worked, but no one seemed to remember why. The dream of expansion had faded, and what replaced it was maintenance, the careful art of keeping things exactly as they were. When civilization stops moving forward, it starts talking to itself. Rome, for all its brilliance, was about to do just that. The 2nd century after the Common Era began with a philosopher on the throne. Marcus Aurelius was not the kind of emperor who threw parties. He preferred reading, thinking, and occasionally sighing at the incompetence of mankind. His personal journal, later called Meditations, reads like therapy notes from a man trying to stay calm while managing the world's largest office. He wrote about virtue, discipline, and accepting fate. Noble ideas that sound less comforting when your empire is on fire. While he pondered the meaning of existence, a plague swept through the provinces, killing millions. The streets fell silent, fields lay untended, and the gods, if they were listening, seemed to have gone on vacation. Marcus tried to stay rational, but reason doesn't cure fever. He ruled wisely, but the empire he loved began to wilt under exhaustion. When he died in the year 180, the Golden Age died with him, and then came his son, Commodus. Commodus was Rome's midlife crisis made flesh. He declared himself a reincarnation of Hercules, wrestled in public arenas, and renamed months after, himself. He even tried renaming Rome Colonia Commodiana, roughly the colony of Commodus. It was the ancient equivalent of changing your Wi-Fi password to I am the best. He fought as a gladiator, though the fights were arranged, so his opponents politely died on schedule. Citizens cheered out of fear, senators wrote apologies in advance, and the empire watched its dignity melt into theatre. Eventually Commodus was strangled in his bath by a man hired to keep him safe, a fitting metaphor for an age when loyalty had become a freelance job. After his death, chaos returned. In 1 year, 5 men claimed the throne. The empire changed hands like a coin tossed between armies. Generals marched on Rome, sold the crown to the highest bidder, and murdered one another in the name of stability. The historian Cassius Dio, who lived through it, described the time as a monarchy of sheer confusion. It was the kind of phrase that sounds like exaggeration until you read the tax records. By the early 3rd century, the Severan dynasty rose to power, promising reform and energy. Septimius Severus, its founder, was a soldier from Africa, competent, ruthless, and fond of reminding everyone that he was both. He strengthened the army, raised pay, and taxed everything that moved. When asked for advice on ruling, he told his sons, "Keep the soldiers rich and ignore everyone else." It was practical, but hardly inspiring. The empire began to feel less like a republic in disguise, and more like a business run by mercenaries. His son Caracalla took the throne after a family feud that ended, as many Roman feuds did, in fratricide. He issued the Constitutio Antoniniana, a decree granting Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. It sounded generous, but it also expanded the tax base. Caracalla, in short, made everyone Roman mostly so they could pay Roman taxes. Still, it had symbolic power. Rome had stopped being a city-state long ago. Now, it was an idea printed on receipts. The Severans kept the borders intact but hollowed out the middle. Corruption spread like mould, civil servants sold favours, and soldiers demanded bonuses they could no longer be denied. Meanwhile, beyond the eastern frontier, a new Persia, the Sassanid Empire was rising, efficient and ambitious. They challenged Rome's dominance in Asia, defeating legions and capturing cities that had been Roman for generations. The empire, once the world's predator, was learning what it felt like to be prey. Culturally, something deeper was shifting. Temples still smoked with incense, but faith had lost its conviction. The old gods were tired, the rituals automatic. Mystery cults multiplied, promising personal salvation to people who no longer trusted public institutions. Astrology, magic, and imported Eastern philosophies flourished. When an empire starts asking the stars for advice, you know the civil service is in trouble. Rome had begun to feel spiritually bankrupt, too organized to believe, too skeptical to hope. Everywhere you looked, the contrast was visible. In the capital, marble still gleamed under the sun, statues still watched with eternal confidence. But the provinces were restless. Trade faltered, roads decayed, border towns became garrisons. The great machine still moved, but now it creaked audibly. Officials sent letters warning of shortages. Governors replied with polite optimism. It was the ancient version of "everything's fine" written on papyrus. And yet, there were still flashes of greatness. Scholars copied books, engineers repaired aqueducts, artists carved gods no one feared anymore. Civilization didn't collapse, it simply drifted. Rome no longer lived for glory, it lived for routine. The empire had turned into its own monument, too proud to admit that time, like any barbarian, can't be negotiated with. If you stood on the Forum in those years, you might not notice the decline at first. The air still smelled of incense and grain, the crowd still buzzed. But look closer, and you'd see the cracks. The senators with fewer followers, the temples with fewer offerings, the faces of people who spoke of destiny with a shrug. The city was still alive, but its soul had gone quiet. For centuries, Romans had believed they were building eternity. Now eternity looked suspiciously like paperwork. Rome didn't fall to invaders in this century. It fell softly into distraction. The citizens still obeyed, the army still marched, but the purpose had dissolved like old ink. And as night fell over the empire, torches flickering, fountains whispering, the distant hum of legionaries counting the hours, you could almost sense it forgetting itself. The empire that had once conquered the world now struggled to remember why it bothered. By the late 3rd century after the Common Era, Rome was exhausted, not defeated, just tired of being itself. For nearly 500 years it had ruled a world that no longer fit neatly on its maps. Civil wars had become seasonal, emperors rose and fell faster than statues could be carved, and armies chose their leaders like gamblers choosing dice. Economy, loyalty, even time itself felt unstable. Something had to change, and that something arrived in the form of a man named Diocletian, a soldier with the soul of an accountant. He wasn't born noble. He came from the lower ranks of the army, a place where you learned two things quickly: how to survive chaos and how to file reports about it. By the year 284, after yet another string of assassinations and mutinies, Diocletian seized power. He didn't promise glory, he promised organization, which for Rome was the closest thing to a miracle, and he delivered. His reforms didn't make the empire glorious again, they made it legible. He began by redrawing the structure of rule itself. Instead of one emperor trying to control an empire stretching from Scotland to Syria, he divided it into manageable sections. 2 senior emperors called Augusti would each have a junior partner called Caesares. Together they formed the Tetrarchy, 4 rulers, 1 nervous system. It was the ancient world's attempt at a team project. The idea was simple. If one emperor was assassinated, the others could continue. If rebellion erupted, someone was always close enough to handle it. For the first time, the Roman world ran not on personality but on procedure. Historians later called it an experiment in shared power. Diocletian probably called it finally getting some sleep. He reorganized provinces, created smaller administrative districts, and appointed officials to watch the officials watching other officials. It was surveillance as governance, effective, humorless, and deeply Roman. Every coin, shipment, and decree had to be tracked. To a weary empire, it felt like oxygen. To later historians, it looked like the birth of bureaucracy. Diocletian didn't build new temples or arenas, he built forms. The next problem was money. Generations of war and inflation had turned the denarius, Rome's coin, into decorative metal. Prices changed faster than tax collectors could chase them, so Diocletian tried the most human solution imaginable. He wrote an instruction manual for the economy. In the year 301, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, an enormous document listing over 1,000 items, from grain and beer to lions and silk. Each product had a legal ceiling, the highest price anyone could charge. Violators were threatened with death, which, historically, has never been the best way to stabilise inflation. Merchants ignored it, markets adjusted, and life went on. Still, the edict survives today as a monument to ambition, the first attempt to control capitalism with a chisel. Despite these rigid measures, Diocletian wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. He saw the empire not as a theatre of glory but as a patient in recovery. He strengthened borders, rebuilt forts, and made the army permanent, professional, and, most importantly, loyal to the state rather than individual generals. He even standardized weights, measures, and uniforms. Under Diocletian, everything had a correct version, including loyalty. But order has a cost, and the empire soon felt it in religion. The Romans had always been tolerant. They liked their gods numerous and their temples busy. Yet Diocletian, in his search for unity, began to see diversity as inefficiency. The Christian movement, growing quietly across provinces, refused to sacrifice to the old gods or to the emperor's genius, the spiritual spark believed to protect the state. To Diocletian, this refusal wasn't heresy, it was administrative sabotage. So he launched what history calls the Great Persecution, an empire-wide attempt to restore religious uniformity through intimidation. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, believers arrested. It was brutal, inconsistent, and ultimately futile. Faith, as Diocletian discovered, is hard to regulate. And then, at the height of his power, he did something almost no Roman ruler had ever done voluntarily. He retired. In the year 305, citing age and illness, Diocletian stepped down and went home to his palace in Dalmatia, modern-day Croatia. He built a vast seaside villa, half fortress and half spa, with gardens full of cabbage. When envoys later visited and begged him to return to power, he reportedly laughed and said, "If you could see the cabbages I grow, you would not ask me to take up the burden again." It was the most peaceful statement ever made by a man who once tried to control the price of lions. His abdication didn't save the system, it simply delayed the inevitable. The tetrarchy began to wobble the moment he left. Ambitious Caesars fought their Augusti. Provinces declared loyalties like customers switching brands. The machinery he built was too perfect for the imperfect humans running it. But his influence endured. The empire would never again be truly single-headed. Even centuries later, the memory of four rulers dividing responsibility lingered in the idea of East and West, of shared power pretending to be unity. Yet Diocletian's reign left behind something subtler, a philosophy of control. He proved that empires could survive chaos not through charisma, but through structure, that paperwork in the right hands could be a weapon, that even collapse can be managed if scheduled properly. He didn't stop Rome from changing, but he did teach it how to take attendance while doing so. If you stood outside his palace today, you'd see its walls still standing, their stones glowing pink in the Dalmatian sun. Tourists wander where clerks once carried ledgers, where an emperor once looked at the sea and thought about vegetables. The waves whisper against the stones, steady, precise, a sound Diocletian would have approved of. It is the sound of order surviving memory. When Diocletian retired to his cabbage fields, he imagined he'd left Rome in perfect balance. 4 rulers, 1 empire, no chaos, at least on paper. But as with all things Roman, what looked balanced on parchment quickly turned into theatre on the ground. His careful system lasted about as long as it took the next generation of emperors to realise that sharing power was less satisfying than owning it. Civil wars returned like an old habit. Borders held, but patience did not. And in the middle of it all, a young commander named Constantine began to rise. He was the son of Constantius, one of Diocletian's junior emperors, and he'd spent his youth watching power misbehave. By the time his father died, Constantine knew exactly what kind of empire he didn't want, one that needed 4 rulers to agree on a single sentence. So, in the year 312 after the Common Era, standing at the edge of another civil war, he chose a simpler path: unity, with himself in charge. But he didn't just march into battle with ambition, he marched with a vision, literally. According to legend, on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine looked up at the sky and saw a sign, a cross of the light above the sun, and words in Latin meaning, "In this sign, conquer." That night he dreamed of Christ telling him to mark the symbol on his soldiers' shields. In the morning he did. When his troops met the rival army outside Rome, they fought under that emblem. Not the eagle, not the thunderbolt of Jupiter, but the cross. They won, and in that victory, the empire quietly changed direction. Whether the vision was divine, psychological, or political hardly matters now. What mattered was the result. Constantine became the sole ruler of the Western Empire, convinced that heaven had given him not just power, but purpose. A year later, in the year 313, he and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan, a law granting freedom of worship to all citizens. For the first time in Roman history, Christianity was not illegal. Temples and churches stood side by side. Faith, once whispered in catacombs, now walked openly in sunlight. Persecution ended and sponsorship began. Constantine didn't convert overnight. He still paid polite respects to the old gods just in case. But over time, his allegiance shifted. He built churches, summoned bishops, and turned Christianity from an underground movement into an institution with offices, budgets, and political influence. The faith of fishermen and carpenters became the faith of senators and scribes. Rome had always known how to absorb ideas. This one it baptized in marble. The change wasn't purely spiritual, it was practical genius. Religion, Constantine realized, could unite what armies and laws could not. An empire fractured by politics might find harmony in shared belief, or at least it might behave better while arguing about theology. He convened councils of bishops to settle disputes, the most famous in the city of Nicaea, where scholars debated whether Christ was divine, human, or somewhere in between. It was the empire's first recorded staff meeting about metaphysics. It lasted months, and predictably, ended with everyone partly satisfied and completely convinced they were right. Meanwhile, Constantine dreamed bigger. He no longer trusted Rome. Too crowded, too nostalgic, too haunted by memories of old senators who still quoted Cicero. He needed a new capital, one that looked eastward, where wealth and trade flowed, and where the future still seemed open. So, on the ancient site of Byzantium, near the blue waters of the Bosporus, he built a new city. He called it Nova Roma, New Rome, though everyone else called it Constantinople, City of Constantine. It was a place of shining domes, wide streets, and defensive walls so massive they would stand for 1,000 years. Rome had been born from a river, its air was born from the sea. The founding of Constantinople marked more than geography, it marked psychology. Power had moved east, quietly, almost politely. The old city remained a museum of triumphs. The new one became the workshop of eternity. Here, Greek culture mingled with Roman law and Christian faith, a triad that would define the next 1,000 years of European history. Constantine himself ruled from his new palace surrounded by mosaics that glowed with gold leaf and candlelight. He issued decrees, minted coins bearing the cross, and sent letters to bishops reminding them to get along, which even then rarely worked. Yet Constantine's faith, like all faith under power, was complex. He outlawed some pagan rituals but kept others for symbolism. He never forced conversion by sword. He preferred persuasion through architecture. Every basilica he built was a sermon in stone, airy, symmetrical, and drenched in light. Visitors walking through their vast halls felt small and infinite at once. It was not fear that converted them, but awe. He turned spirituality into an empire-wide aesthetic. Faith became infrastructure. Of course, mixing politics and heaven always leads to paperwork. The empire now had 2 chains of command, one earthly, one divine. Emperors sponsored bishops. Bishops blessed emperors. It worked beautifully until it didn't. Doctrines clashed, councils multiplied, and Christianity itself began dividing into factions: Eastern, Western, Orthodox, Arian. But for a brief, shining moment, Constantine's world felt aligned. The heavens and the empire, both under one management. He had done what no Roman before him had dared. He claimed the sky for administration. When Constantine died in the year 337, he was buried in Constantinople in a church of his own design, surrounded by 12 empty coffins symbolising the apostles, as if he planned to join their company by seniority. He was baptised on his deathbed, the ultimate gesture of divine timing. After him, Christianity was no longer an outsider's faith. It was the empire's software, running temples, calendars, and conscience alike. If you stand today beneath the domes of Istanbul, once Constantinople, you can still sense that merger of earth and eternity. The echo of footsteps, the scent of wax and incense, the soft glimmer of mosaics. It feels less like a city and more like an idea that refused to end. That was Constantine's gift, or his illusion. He made heaven administrative and gave bureaucracy a soul. When Constantine died, the empire he left behind glittered like a mosaic, dazzling from a distance, cracked up close. The marble shone, the temples hummed with incense, and the new capital sparkled by the sea. But beneath the light, there was a quiet fault line stretching invisibly across the map. It wasn't drawn by armies or rivers, but by language, culture, and fatigue. Rome had become too big to share one soul. For a while, it pretended otherwise. His sons divided the empire between them, as heirs always do, with good intentions and bad results. East and West, 2 halves of the same inheritance, glaring at each other over the Mediterranean like divorced parents arguing about who gets the library. The eastern half, ruled from Constantinople, was rich, urban, and multilingual, a place of scholars, gold, and diplomacy. The western half, ruled from Rome and later Ravenna, was familiar but fraying. Its roads cracked, its armies thinned, and its senators clung to tradition the way old furniture clings to dust. In the east, life went on. Trade flowed through the ports, silk and spices glittered in the markets, and taxes arrived mostly on time. Greek became the language of the educated. Latin lingered politely in the background. The bureaucrats of Constantinople learned to turn policy into poetry, each decree a miniature epic written in elegant script. They called themselves Romans, but they were already something new, a civilization built on survival through refinement. They would one day be known as the Byzantines, though they never used the word themselves. They didn't need a new name. They were Rome that still worked. In the West, things looked less poetic. Frontiers were harder to hold, revenues harder to collect. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and Danube. not as invaders at first, but as migrants. Families seeking land, safety, and sometimes a good Roman road to follow. They came because Rome had once promised order, and even in decline, its ruins looked safer than freedom. The empire tried to settle them as foederati, allied peoples paid to defend the borders they had just crossed. It was outsourcing with swords. The plan worked on parchment, which is where most Roman plans worked best. But the strain showed. The legions were underpaid, the generals overambitious, and the emperors mostly temporary. Every few years a new one appeared with a new slogan and the same old problem. Too much land, too few loyal soldiers, too many unpaid bills. The Western court moved to Ravenna, a city surrounded by swamps that were easier to defend than to enjoy. From there, they issued decrees to provinces that no longer listened, and sent envoys to Constantinople asking for help that never arrived. The East nodded politely and went back to counting taxes. Meanwhile, the map kept changing colour. Vandals took North Africa, Visigoths settled in Spain, and the once proud city of Rome became a symbol rather than a centre. The population shrank, the baths went cold, and the forum filled with weeds. Still, life continued. Farmers worked, children played, and priests preached about eternal salvation to congregations surrounded by collapsing roofs. Empires don't die suddenly, they fade by repetition. Each year looked just stable enough to believe in another. Culturally, the East and West drifted apart in faith as well as fortune. Greek theology filled the councils of Constantinople, while Latin bishops in the West emphasized law and authority. One side debated the nature of divinity, the other worried about how to pay the army. The same religion spoke with two accents, one philosophical, one practical. When they prayed, they faced the same heaven but saw different skylines. The East gazed upward to domes of gold, the West knelt under rafters patched with hope. Yet for all its troubles, the Western Empire still tried to pretend. Emperors still held triumphs, even if they had no victories. Senators still debated, though fewer listened. Coins still bore the image of emperors who would not live long enough to spend them. The rituals of empire outlived its certainty. Rome, that master of illusion, was now performing itself. Marble makeup on a tired face. In the year 410, the illusion cracked. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, marched into Italy and sacked Rome. For 3 days, the eternal city burned. The temples that had survived fires, earthquakes, and Nero's taste in architecture finally fell to men who once served as Rome's allies. The world gasped. St. Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, said, "If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" It was less a question than an obituary. But the city rose again, scarred yet standing. It always did. Meanwhile, in the east, Constantinople endured, insulated by walls so thick and wealth so deep that even chaos arrived there politely. Its emperors called themselves defenders of orthodoxy, guardians of order, and occasionally God's personal assistants. They watched the West decline with sympathy and calculation. Helping might be noble, but survival was wiser. When refugees and broken legions arrived from Italy, the East welcomed them with ceremony and sent them home with paperwork. As the 5th century waned, one last flicker of grandeur remained. Generals like Aetius still held the Huns at bay. Scholars still copied Virgil by candlelight. Bishops still claimed Rome's destiny was spiritual, not political. And perhaps they were right, for while the empire crumbled, its faith spread. The same roads that carried legions now carried monks and manuscripts. Out of collapse grew continuity. By the year 476, the final act arrived quietly. A Germanic general named Odoacer deposed the teenage emperor Romulus Augustulus, a boy with a name too poetic for his own century. No one wept, no trumpet sounded. The Senate simply sent the imperial regalia east to Constantinople, acknowledging that one emperor was enough. The Western Empire was over, though few noticed on the day it happened. People still woke, still baked bread, still argued over taxes. Rome had fallen into the most Roman of conclusions, administrative closure. Yet something curious remained. Even in the ruins, the idea of Rome refused to die. Kings in the West still called themselves Roman. The church still wrote in Latin. Law and architecture still carried the old geometry. The East, soon to be called Byzantine, kept the torch alight, half memory, half miracle. It would shine for another 1,000 years, illuminating Europe's darkened corners with the glow of an empire that technically no longer existed. If you stand today in Ravenna, under the golden mosaics that once looked east toward Constantinople, you can feel both halves breathing, one slow, one steady. The silence of loss and the hum of survival. The empire had split, but the idea of Rome, stubborn and administrative as ever, continued filing reports long after everyone else had gone home. By the early 5th century after the Common Era, the Roman Empire was still standing, at least on paper. The maps were large, the titles impressive, and the paperwork astonishingly thorough. But the soldiers were tired, the treasury was hollow, and the borders were made of hope. The empire that once conquered the world now struggled to hire it. The problem was simple. Rome no longer had enough Romans. Generations of wars, plagues and politics had thinned its citizen armies. The legions that once thundered with discipline now whispered with complaints. So the emperors turned to a new idea, hiring outsiders. They called them federati, allied peoples who would defend the frontiers in exchange for land, pay, and the privilege of pretending they weren't enemies. Goths, Franks, Vandals, and others filled the ranks. They marched beneath Roman banners, swore Roman oaths, and were paid in Roman coin whenever the empire remembered to send it. It was defense by delegation, or as modern management might call it, strategic outsourcing. At first it worked. The new soldiers were fierce, loyal to their generals, and usually indifferent to politics. They fought off raids, built forts, and even kept the peace in places the Senate had forgotten existed. But loyalty, like taxes, was easiest to maintain while the payments arrived. When the money ran out, the alliances frayed. Some groups began settling on Roman soil as permanent guests who never quite left. Soon, whole provinces were defended by people the empire no longer controlled. It was security built on good intentions and expired contracts. Then, in the year 410, the unthinkable happened. Alaric, a Gothic leader who had once served Rome faithfully, marched his army into Italy. He had fought for the empire, negotiated with it, and been repeatedly ignored by it. Now, after years of broken promises, he decided to collect his payment in person. His troops surrounded the capital. The city that had stood for nearly 8 centuries, that had watched empires rise and kings kneel, was suddenly defenseless. For 3 days the eternal city burned. Temples crumbled, houses collapsed, and the sound of boots echoed through. Marble streets built for triumphs. It wasn't total destruction, but it was enough to break the illusion that Rome was untouchable. Even the gods, if they were watching, must have looked away out of embarrassment. People fled, priests prayed, and the Senate panicked politely. Letters carried the news across the Mediterranean like smoke signals of despair. St. Jerome, writing in distant Bethlehem, confessed that he couldn't stop crying. If Rome can fall, he asked, what can be safe? The answer, of course, was nothing. And yet, even after the sack, the city remained. Wounded, smaller, but somehow still Rome. It had learned long ago that survival isn't the opposite of ruin, it's what comes after it. The decades that followed felt like a long exhale. The empire was still enormous in name, but its edges kept curling inward. In the north, the Franks settled in Gaul. In the south, the Vandals seized North Africa, taking with them the grain supply that had once fed the capital. They built ships and sailed across the sea to plunder cities that had once paid them tribute. When they sacked Rome again in 455, They were so methodical about it that historians later admired their organisation. Even in chaos, Rome's influence endured. It had taught its conquerors how to be efficient. To the east, the Huns appeared, moving across the plains like a storm without weather. Led by Attila, they rode faster than rumour and struck harder than prophecy. The western provinces trembled. Cities fortified their walls, priests clutched relics, and the emperor prayed that the eastern court might send reinforcements. Attila demanded gold, received it, and promised peace, a business model still popular today. He died soon after, reportedly at a wedding feast. The empire survived him, though by then survival was measured in months, not victories. Economically, things were worse than the map suggested. Tax revenues shrank. Coins were clipped and reclipped until they looked like metal confetti. Officials wrote reports about the crisis, stamped them, and sent them to offices that no longer existed. Merchants avoided trade routes now haunted by bandits and unpaid soldiers. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, became an unpredictable frontier. The empire's arteries still pulsed, but the blood was thin. It was like watching a giant forget why it started walking. Culturally, the mood had shifted too. The confidence of earlier centuries, the marble pride of Augustus, the legal certainty of Justinian's predecessors was gone. In its place came weary faith and private endurance. People no longer believed Rome would last forever. They believed it would end quietly after dinner, while they were still making plans for tomorrow. Even the barbarians seemed confused. They hadn't meant to destroy Rome, they just wanted to join it. But by the time they arrived, the empire had already misplaced the instructions for being Roman. The sound of collapse wasn't thunder, it was paper. Decrees that no one read, tax notices that no one delivered, soldiers writing to families who no longer had addresses. Dust settled over statues whose faces no one could recognize anymore. The air smelled of smoke, parchment, and old bronze. Somewhere, a clerk kept copying records because that was his job, and Rome's genius had always been the ability to continue even when there was nothing left to continue for. If you had stood in the Forum around this time, you would have seen weeds sprouting between broken stones, and heard the faint echo of what used to be power. The columns still stood, but they looked tired, as if waiting for someone to apologize. The marble lips of old emperors still murmured in the wind, but the words had become meaningless. The empire hadn't fallen, it had drifted away like sand leaving a footprint. By the middle of the 5th century, what remained of Rome was a habit. Soldiers still saluted, officials still sealed documents, citizens still said Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome, though neither had much to offer the other. It was theatre now, but comforting theatre, because sometimes pretending stability is the last form of stability left. Even as the Western Empire trembled, Constantinople in the east remained alive, rich, walled, and distant. It sent polite condolences when the West suffered, but little else. The empire had learned to survive by splitting itself in two, one half managing history, the other dissolving into it. By the time the curtain finally fell, the audience had already left. The actors bowed to an empty stage, their applause coming only from memory. By the middle of the 5th century after the Common Era, the Western Roman Empire had the look of an ancient actor still performing long after the audience had gone home. The costumes were magnificent, the lines memorized, but the theatre was half in ruins. Behind the curtains, the stagehands were leaving one by one. The empire hadn't fallen yet. It was simply waiting for someone polite enough to tell it the show was over. That someone turned out to be a teenager. His name was Romulus Augustulus, though historians usually shorten it, perhaps out of pity. It was a cruelly poetic name. Romulus, the mythical founder of Rome, and Augustus, the title of its first emperor. He carried in his name both the beginning and the height of empire, and he appeared at the end of it. He was placed on the throne in the year 475, not by fate or heroism, but by his father, a general named Orestes, who needed a figurehead small enough to fit on a chair of power without making anyone nervous. The boy was about 15, an emperor in title, a student in everything else. He signed decrees he didn't write and nodded at ceremonies he barely understood. It was government by gesture, rule by stationery. The empire he inherited was smaller than most modern countries. Gone were the provinces of Spain, Britain and Africa. Even Italy itself was frayed, a patchwork of independent commanders, Gothic mercenaries, and exhausted cities that paid taxes out of habit rather than hope. The capital had moved to Ravenna, a quiet lagoon city surrounded by swamps that served as natural moats. It was damp, defensive, and deeply symbolic, the perfect retirement home for an empire allergic to change. The real power lay with the army, and most of that army was made up of men from beyond Rome's borders. Among them was a general named Odoacer, a Germanic leader who had fought for Rome long enough to learn its manners. When his troops demanded land and pay that Orestes refused to grant, Odoacer simply stopped pretending. He marched on Ravenna, defeated Orestes, and presented young Romulus with a decision. He could resist and die or abdicate and live. The boy chose wisely. On a calm day in the year 476, Romulus Augustulus removed the imperial insignia, the diadem, the purple cloak, and handed them over. There were no riots, no cries, no celestial omens. The Senate, now more ceremonial than functional, politely drafted a letter to the emperor in Constantinople, explaining that the West no longer required its own ruler. The regalia were sent east, and with them, the last administrative breath of Western Rome. It was the end of an era that refused to sound like one. Odoacer did not destroy the empire. He simply stopped pretending it existed. He ruled Italy as king, under nominal loyalty to the Eastern Emperor. He maintained the bureaucracy, paid the officials, and let the Senate keep its dignified fictions. To ordinary Romans, life continued with unnerving normality. The baker still baked, the farmer still ploughed, and the tax collector still arrived on time, proving once again that bureaucracy is the most immortal form of civilization. Rome didn't fall with a scream. It filed for retirement. The chroniclers of the time were almost embarrassed by how uneventful it felt. No flaming skies, no earthquakes, no divine trumpet announcing the apocalypse. Just a letter, a signature, and the quiet shuffling of sandals on marble floors. The date 476 later became famous, but at the time, it was just another year of paperwork. Even the people who lived through it probably didn't realise anything particularly historic had happened. Empires, like people, rarely recognise their own final days while they're still paying rent. As for the boy emperor, his story ends with unusual mercy. Odoacer spared him, a rare courtesy in imperial politics. Romulus was sent to live in comfort with his family on the Bay of Naples, near a villa surrounded by vineyards and sea wind. No more speeches, no more ceremonies, just quiet waves brushing against the stones where empire had turned into memory. History loses track of him after that. Some say he lived many years in peace, watching the sunsets over a world no longer his to rule. Others say he died young, anonymous but free, the only Roman emperor to retire without scandal or dagger. And what of the empire he left behind? The idea of Rome did not die, it merely changed address. In Constantinople, the Eastern emperors continued to rule for another 1,000 years, calling themselves Basilius Romaeon, Emperor of the Romans. To them, the West was not dead, just temporarily unavailable. They still saw the Mediterranean as their backyard and Latin as a quaint but respectable accent. Rome had split, but its reflection still glowed faintly in the Eastern Sea. In the West, the word Roman became a compliment rather than a nationality. The Church took over where the Senate had failed. Popes sat in the old imperial palaces, bishops wrote laws in Latin, and monks copied the works of Cicero by candlelight. The empire had vanished, yet its habits refused to. Roads, walls, aqueducts, all the bones of Rome remained, outliving every conqueror who thought he was starting something new. If you walk through Italy a century later, you could still feel the outline of empire beneath your feet, like the faint pressure of a footprint long after the traveller has gone. When historians later pointed to the year 476 as the fall of Rome, they were simplifying a sigh into a sentence. Rome didn't collapse, it settled. It folded into the soil of Europe, into the languages, the laws, the sense that civilization should have schedules and drains. Its end was less a tragedy than a long pause, the deep breath before the world started calling itself something else. If you listen closely, you can still hear it. Not the roar of triumph or the clash of armies, but the sound of parchment turning, of footsteps in empty corridors, of wind moving through marble archways. The empire ended quietly, respectfully, the way all great things do when they have said enough. The last emperor walked away, the lights dimmed, and history wrote down the date as if it mattered. But in the east, beyond the sea and the centuries, another Rome was still awake, surrounded by walls that would outlast the Middle Ages, guarded by scribes who still began every decree the same way, Imperium Romanum. The Western Empire had closed its books, but the story wasn't finished. It never really is. If Rome had fallen in the West, it had merely shifted its chair in the East. Across the blue waters of the Bosporus, the empire continued its morning routine, opening scrolls, counting taxes, and reminding itself that eternity, properly managed, was still possible. Constantinople stood where Europe met Asia, a glittering hinge between worlds. To call it the Eastern Roman Empire is technically correct, but spiritually misleading. To its people, it was still simply Rome, cleaner, wealthier, and more confident than ever, as if decline were a rumour started by other people. The city itself was a marvel of stubborn order. Great walls of layered stone guarded its edges, triple lines of defence that turned back wave after wave of invaders. Even earthquakes seemed to apologise before approaching. Inside those walls, domes rose like bubbles of gold. Mosaics caught the light like tiny suns. Merchants from every direction filled its streets. Persians, Arabs, Italians, Slavs, all arguing about exchange rates and salvation. If the West was a ruin, the East was a library. Rome, reinvented, had traded conquest for administration and ambition for architecture. It had discovered immortality through paperwork and mortar. At the heart of this renewed world ruled Emperor Justinian, who ascended the throne in the 6th century after the Common Era, with a plan that could only have come from someone who didn't sleep much. He wanted to reunite the empire, restore its laws, and remind history that Rome wasn't finished yet. Under his command, generals like Belisarius marched west to reclaim Italy and North Africa. For a brief, shining moment, they succeeded. The empire's borders stretched once again across the Mediterranean. But glory, as always, came with receipts. Wars drained the treasury, plagues thinned the population, and the newly reclaimed provinces immediately began rebelling for nostalgia's sake. Still, for a few years the map looked Roman again, and that was almost enough. While soldiers fought, scholars wrote, Justinian ordered a massive project, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. It was the empire's legal DNA, centuries of decrees, opinions, and precedents collected, edited, and polished into coherence. Lawyers have been thanking and cursing him ever since. From that codex came the backbone of European legal tradition. You can still feel it today whenever a judge quotes a Latin phrase with unnecessary confidence. Rome's armies had faded, but its logic had not. In Byzantium, law became a form of architecture, invisible, orderly, and designed to outlast the builder. And then there was the Hagia Sophia, Justinian's masterpiece. When it was completed, he entered the new basilica and, according to legend, whispered, "Solomon, I have outdone you." It wasn't arrogance so much as relief. The building rose like a dome suspended from heaven itself, its windows scattering light as if it were liquid gold. Inside, the air shimmered with incense and chant. The city had turned theology into geometry. Even today, when you stand beneath that vast dome, you can still hear the echo of centuries, the hum of belief rendered in stone. Faith had found an architect. Byzantium didn't just survive, it evolved. It became a fusion. Roman in structure, Greek in language, Christian in spirit. Its emperors ruled by divine sanction, its scholars copied ancient texts, and its artisans painted saints with eyes too calm for mortals. They believed order itself was sacred, that every detail, from the colour of a robe to the angle of a mosaic tile, reflected cosmic harmony. The empire no longer expanded by conquest but by continuity. Its walls became its theology, unbroken, enduring, and politely ignoring the passage of time. Of course, even endurance needs maintenance. Byzantine politics was famously intricate, part chess, part opera. Courtiers schemed with monastic discipline, generals plotted with diplomatic flair, and theologians argued about the exact composition of the divine. The empire's greatest export, besides silk and taxes, was opinion. Every few decades, a council would gather to decide which version of truth the empire preferred this season. But while faiths fractured, the state endured. Bureaucracy, not belief, was the true unifying creed. As one historian once joked, the capital moved, the language changed, the tax collectors stayed exactly the same. Economically, Byzantium thrived. It controlled the trade routes between east and west, taxing everything that glittered. Its coin, the solidus, became the world's gold standard, small, reliable, and universally desired. Merchants trusted Byzantine currency even when they didn't trust Byzantine promises. For centuries, while Europe stumbled through its dark ages, Constantinople remained bright, a lighthouse of literacy, diplomacy, and stubborn bookkeeping. Where others counted time in centuries of chaos, Byzantines counted interest. Yet beneath the splendour, a quiet melancholy lingered. They knew they were living in the afterlife of an empire, a civilization haunted by its own perfection. Every marble column whispered stories of Julius Caesar and Augustus. Every law bore Latin ghosts. The Byzantines didn't deny it, they curated it. They treated the past the way a museum treats relics, with reverence and constant renovation. To live in Constantinople was to live inside memory made tangible. If you walked through its streets at dusk, you might hear church bells mingling with the cries of vendors, the rustle of silk against marble steps, the gentle splash of oars in the harbour. The scent of incense and sea salt would mix in the air. Somewhere in the distance, scribes copied ancient texts by lamplight, unaware that they were saving the foundations of future Europe one tired handstroke at a time. Rome had not died. It had become eternal through repetition. And though enemies surrounded it, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Crusaders, the empire held on. Even when it lost territory, it never lost identity. It was the art of survival perfected, flexible, intelligent, slightly paranoid, and endlessly administrative. When others saw crisis, Byzantium saw an opportunity to issue another decree. If immortality could be achieved through documentation, they had already achieved it. By the time Western Europe rediscovered philosophy and indoor plumbing, Byzantium was still writing letters, stamping seals, and patching walls. It wasn't youth that sustained it, but professionalism. For nearly 1,000 years after Rome's supposed fall, the Eastern Empire kept its lamps lit against the dark. When its enemies looked at those glowing walls, they saw a city. But Byzantines looked outward and saw an idea: Rome, uninterrupted. If you listen closely enough, you can still hear Rome breathing, not through armies or decrees anymore, but through the quiet persistence of things that refuse to disappear. A road here, a calendar there, a sense that rules should exist even when no one follows them. The empire may have gone to dust, but its habits never did. They drifted through the centuries like well-trained ghosts, whispering to anyone who tried to build a civilization from the rubble. Rome had stopped conquering the world. Now it was haunting it, gently, efficiently, and permanently. When the Western Empire dissolved in the 5th century after the Common Era, its fragments did not vanish. They rearranged themselves. In Italy, bishops took the place of governors. In Gaul and Spain, local lords built villas on top of old Roman foundations and still called their meetings senates because the word sounded respectable. Even barbarian kings hired Roman scribes to keep their records tidy and their Latin grammar passable. Civilization, it turned out, was contagious. Once you've learned to admire aqueducts, it's hard to go back to mud huts. The roads remained. They cut through forests and hills, ignoring the new kingdoms that grew like weeds around them. Pilgrims followed them to shrines. Merchants used them to sell hope and salt. Soldiers of a dozen languages still marched on their stones. Centuries later, when medieval monks needed to travel from monastery to monastery, they walked the same paths legions once patrolled. They may not have known it, but their footsteps completed the empire's final dream, a world connected by routine rather than rule. Rome's laws survived too, hidden inside the monasteries that copied everything, even the things they didn't like. The Corpus Juris Civilis, Justinian's legal code, passed from parchment to parchment like a holy contagion. Long after emperors stopped existing, their footnotes did not. When scholars in medieval Italy rediscovered those texts in the 12th century, they treated them like sacred relics. Universities began to form around them, professors lecturing on Roman law as if it was scripture. And in a sense, it was. A revelation not from heaven but from bureaucracy. Even now, when a modern lawyer says habeas corpus or prima facie, they're performing a small séance with the ghosts of Justinian's clerks. The empire also left behind its way of measuring time. The Julian calendar, designed under Julius Caesar, kept Europe punctual for more than 1,500 years. Its months, named for long-dead politicians and forgotten gods, still dictate our appointments. We complain about February's length without realising it's a gift from ancient reforms. Every time you check a calendar or curse a Monday, you're continuing the administrative rhythm of Rome, the empire that organised eternity into 30-day increments. Even religion became a Roman export. Christianity had been born in the provinces, but it grew up in the empire's shadow, structured, codified, and eventually headquartered in Rome itself. The church borrowed more than the language. It adopted the hierarchy, the architecture, even the fashion. Popes inherited the title Pontifex Maximus, once held by pagan emperors, and sat in marble halls built by men who worshipped different gods but loved the same geometry. Mass became a ceremony of order, the empire reborn as ritual. If Augustus had seen it, he might have nodded approvingly and asked only who was in charge of the census. Through the early Middle Ages, when Europe seemed dim and divided, the Roman idea still flickered, not as conquest but as aspiration. Kings styled themselves Caesar, cities claimed descent from ancient colonies, and poets described the ruins as sleeping giants. To rebuild meant to imitate Rome. To rule meant to pretend you were continuing it. Even chaos needed a Roman precedent, and then, centuries later, it returned in marble. The Renaissance, literally rebirth, was not so much an awakening as a long sigh of recognition. Artists and scholars looked at crumbling columns and saw not loss but instruction. They redrew them, measured them, rebuilt them. They read Cicero and Livy not as dusty relics but as old friends. Florence, Venice, and eventually even Paris and London filled their cities with domes and arches that echoed the empire's confidence. Michelangelo's frescoes, Raphael's faces, Brunelleschi's dome all spoke fluent Roman. The world had remembered its reflection. The irony, of course, is that every civilization that rediscovered Rome also repeated its mistakes. They loved its beauty, its logic, its ambition, and its arrogance. Empires in every age copied its structures, and like Rome, each believed it was the last. From the Holy Roman Empire to the British, from marble to marble again, every great power tried on the Roman posture and wondered why it felt so heavy. Rome's greatest invention wasn't architecture or law, it was self-confidence, mass-produced. And yet, something gentler endured, a belief in roads that connect instead of divide, in written rules rather than sudden whims, in cities built not for survival but for ceremony. Even modern bureaucracy, for all its frustrations, carries a faint echo of Roman order. Endless forms, missing signatures, divine delays. When you wait in line at an office and wonder why it takes so long, remember, this is history's most persistent empire. Rome never ended, it just became customer service. If you wander through Europe today, you can still find it everywhere. In a bridge, still carrying carts in southern France, in a column standing alone in Tunisia, in the Latin carved above a church door in Spain. Even in words, Senate, Republic, Citizen, the syllables are fossils of empire, polished by time until they sound natural again. You may not see the eagle anymore, but its shadow crosses every courthouse, every dome, every city that calls itself civilized. The empire has outlived the emperors, it became memory with infrastructure, and somewhere in all that inheritance there's still the echo of its beginning. A small settlement by the Tiber, a few huts, a myth about a wolf and two brothers arguing about walls. It began in legend, rose through discipline, and dissolved into habit. From that riverbank to the stars on modern flags, the pattern remains the same. Build, believe, decline, remember. Rome wasn't just a place, it was a way of thinking. That order could make chaos polite, that permanence could be planned. And though the stones cracked, the thought persisted. So tonight, as the world sleeps, you can imagine the empire still humming faintly beneath your feet, a rhythm of calendars, roads, and laws that never truly stopped. From a wolf's myth to a city of laws, from ashes to echoes, Rome never really ended. It just became the habit of history itself,